Hi everyone. In this video, there are two unsettling accounts. One follows a group of travelers who crossed a restricted boundary in the Australian outback. The other focuses on a quiet anomaly inside a scientific system, where a hidden data layer began behaving in unexpected ways. This video is meant for calm, immersive listening, a chance to slow down, relax, and quietly think about what might exist just beyond the edges of familiar maps. The restricted line. Late at night, at a small hospital on the edge of the Australian outback, the night doctor was preparing to end his shift when a dusty SUV pulled up to the entrance. 3 people stepped out, young, sunburned, but looking as if they had aged years in a single day. They were barely holding themselves together, spoke English with familiar accents, and kept glancing back at the door as if expecting someone else to follow them inside. One had thin cuts across his face and neck. Another had red lines on her skin, like burns left by fishing line. The third could barely drink water, his lips cracked, his tongue sticking to the roof of his mouth. The doctor asked a simple question. Where was the 4th person? They looked at each other and started talking all at once, stumbling over their words. Something about a camera, about someone stepping away just for a minute, about not making it in time. The details blurred, but one phrase kept repeating. They had crossed the line. It was not empty there, and they were never supposed to be inside. The doctor wrote what he could. He had seen panic attacks, dehydration, heat stroke, but the burns on the woman's skin were too even, like thin threads dragged across her body in a single direction. An hour later, 2 park rangers entered the intake room, followed by a man in plain clothes with no insignia. The rangers behaved professionally, but their eyes focused less on the injuries and more on faces. The man spoke calmly and briefly. He confirmed names, asked for phones to verify signal and coordinates, and offered paperwork to sign, citing a violation of a protected area and a non-disclosure requirement. No one threatened anyone, but the air in the room shifted. It no longer felt like a hospital. It felt procedural. Later, Maya Collins would say that this was the moment she realized arguing was pointless. While attention drifted elsewhere, she quietly removed a tiny memory card from her phone, wrapped it in plastic, and slipped it into her boot under the insole. Not because she believed in conspiracies, because instinct told her that anything left in their hands would disappear. A week earlier, they had arrived in Australia as ordinary tourists. Ethan Moore was drawn to forbidden places and edge-of-the-map legends. Every trip he planned started not with guidebooks, but with forums. Maya filmed and edited short videos, calm and observational, without exaggeration. Daniel Brooks handled the technical side. Batteries, GPS units, chargers, radios. Rachel Turner was the cautious one, usually the person who stopped reckless ideas before they went too far. This time she failed. The idea sounded too simple. Just look at the fence and leave. They drove inland, stopped at campgrounds, listened to locals talk. In a roadside cafe, an older mechanic said something that stuck harder than any horror story. He did not whisper or dramatize it. He simply said the line was not only there for animals, it was there to keep people from walking into places where others vanished quietly. He added that in some areas near the line, maps became strangely empty. Not because there was nothing there, but because that was easier. At a hostel, the administrator looked at them for a long moment when they mentioned the line and said evenly, "If you see a patrol, do not argue. They will tell you that you overheated, and that will be the end of it." It sounded less like advice and more like a reminder of a script that had already been used. Ethan decided that was exactly why they should check it. No hysteria, no theatrics, just honest footage. Daniel found an old satellite image showing a service road and a maintained section of the fence. Maya packed light: water, medical kit, camera, a spare memory card. Rachel insisted on one rule: if anything felt wrong, they would leave immediately. Everyone agreed. Later, that agreement felt like a weak joke. At dawn, the fence did not look improvised. It stretched cleanly toward the horizon, stood on solid posts, and looked recently maintained. The mesh was tight, without sagging. On some posts hung simple signs without logos. Warnings, pictograms, short phrases, not about wildlife, about danger and responsibility. Daniel noticed the first detail that could not be explained by heat. His phone showed signal, but calls would not connect. GPS locked briefly, then jumped dozens of feet, as if someone were smoothing the image and refusing to let it settle. He tried multiple apps. The results stayed the same. He joked about interference. No one laughed. The gate they found matched the map. The hinges were lubricated. The lock looked new. Ethan noticed a spot where the mesh was slightly lifted from the ground, as if it were used regularly. Not by animals, but by people or small equipment. They slipped through quickly, careful not to leave marks. On the other side, the air changed immediately. Not colder, not hotter, quieter. Birds nearly vanished. The wind moved evenly but carried no familiar sounds. Ahead of them stretched a wide strip of scorched earth, kept empty on purpose. Maya filmed the first shots. They looked calm, almost boring. That was what made them disturbing later. No music, no commentary, just a fence, dry ground, and the feeling of stepping somewhere they did not belong. Beyond the line, there was no wild jungle. The land looked maintained. Flat sections suggested machinery had passed through. Small posts with unmarked tags stood at intervals. Occasionally, a track appeared, too straight to be accidental, too empty to be a normal road. A few miles in, they found a small windowless structure. The door was locked. Around it lay damp clay footprints, even though the ground everywhere else was dry and hard. On the wall hung a laminated sheet listing codes, times, short notes, a maintenance schedule. Rachel said someone came here regularly, not sometimes, on a routine. Farther on, near low scrub, Rachel spotted something that made her stop cold. A footprint, not a hoof, not a paw, not a tire. A wide impression with a soft arc, like a sole, but far too large and heavy. Maya filmed it with a water bottle for scale. That was when the footage first turned genuinely unsettling. The size left no room for jokes. Then came the sound. Not a roar, not an engine. A long, frictional scrape, like metal sliding against metal somewhere far away. The source could not be located. The air stayed still. The sound arrived in waves, as if something were switching on and off. Ethan suggested machinery. Daniel nodded, but his eyes said otherwise. Machinery is usually visible. This was only presence. They reached a small body of water that did not exist on their map. The water was warm. A faint mist hovered above the surface, like the land itself breathing. The surrounding grass was greener than it should have been. Something emerged from the water, large, pale, with a smooth line along its back. From its forehead rose a long projection, like a horn, not decorative, not mythical, something structural, part of the skull. It moved calmly, without urgency, as if the place belonged to it. The creature stopped at the water's edge, lowered its head, and the mist settled more evenly, as if the air shifted with its movement. Maya kept filming. Daniel activated the secondary camera on his strap. Rachel whispered that they needed to leave. Ethan did what people do when faced with the impossible. He stepped closer, wanting a clean shot. As Maya zoomed, the image briefly distorted, but the outline of the creature remained. Not camera shake, more like a momentary blindness. The creature lifted its head and looked toward them. There was no aggression in the gaze. There was recognition. Then it turned and disappeared into the scrub, silent, precise, as if it knew every step. Ethan captured one sharp frame. That frame would later become the most problematic, because it looked too real. They chose a different route back, avoiding their own tracks. Daniel thought it was logical. Rachel thought it was a mistake. They entered a sparse stand of trees where shade offered relief from the heat. Maya triggered the first trap. She stepped forward and was yanked back as if caught. Nothing was visible. When Daniel turned on his flashlight, thin threads appeared at chest and face level. They did not snap like spider silk. They stretched, held, sliced skin into fine lines. Rachel tried to help and instantly burned her wrist like touching hot filament. Daniel pulled a knife and began cutting. The threads resisted. That was the worst part. They were not accidental. They were constructed. Corridors of threads formed structured walls, as if someone had built a system. From deeper in the trees came a heavy rustling. Not fast, massive. Branches swayed above without wind. They never saw the thing fully. Only movement, taller than a person, and a shadow that swallowed the light. Once free, Maya ran first. Rachel grabbed her arm, forcing controlled movement. Daniel escaped but lost his pack and water. Ethan tried to retrieve the camera, costing them seconds they could not afford. When they reached open ground, their hands shook. Thin red lines marked their skin like tags. By midday, the heat turned brutal. They reached an old dirt road, likely a service track. That was when they saw what they later called the main event. On the horizon rose a towering figure. Its posture was too stable, its steps too infrequent. The ground answered each one with dull impacts, like a heavy machine walking. Ethan called it a mirage. But mirages do not block vegetation. Mirages do not leave prints. These did, wide, matching the earlier impression. Maya tried to film. The shadow swallowed contrast. The image flattened. One thought clicked cleanly. If they stopped, they would not make it. The chase was ugly. Running, falling, rising. Rachel tore her knee but kept moving. Daniel dragged Maya when her leg locked. Ethan tried to activate the camera again, nearly getting them killed when the screen lit the dry wash they hid in. Above them passed a heavy sound, like something sampling the air. Then, exactly on cue, a patrol SUV appeared. The Rangers moved fast, without questions, as if they expected someone today. One said only, "Get in. Now." Ethan tried to mention the fourth person. The Ranger cut him off. Later. Later sounded final. They were not taken to a police station. First came a restricted facility near the zone. An hangar, water, medical supplies, forms, injuries treated like steps in a checklist. The man in plain clothes returned, almost friendly. They had violated restricted land. They overheated. They lost orientation. They were lucky. Now they needed to formalize things. Phones and cameras were taken for documentation and coordinate verification. Again, no threats. Just a frame that could not be exited. Rachel asked about the fourth person. The answer never changed. Search ongoing. Do not interfere. You are not in condition. Maya tried to argue and was offered a sedative for stress. Daniel noticed the conversation always returned to heat and panic, as if no other version was permitted. Ethan understood the worst part. Their story had already been written. When they returned home and tried to recover their material, almost everything was gone. Files corrupted, videos unreadable, photos replaced with blank gray blocks. Only what Maya hid in her boot survived. The memory card held fragments: the fence, the structure, the footprint, a short clip at the warm water, one sharp frame of the pale creature. When Maya showed it to friends, they went quiet, then said it was editing. They tried to speak. People listened, smiled, dismissed it. Then came the cleanup. Calm. Adult. Experts explained heat stroke and hallucinations. Commentators said the Outback plays tricks on the mind. It was convenient. It required no investigation. Ethan later repeated one thought, not as a revelation, but as exhaustion. The most frightening part was not the creature or the threads. It was that they were expected, not by name, but by outcome. As if beyond the line, life follows different rules, and anyone who crosses becomes not a witness, but an error that must be removed. The fence was not there for animals. It was there to keep that territory closed. The land beneath the white layer. The overnight model run at a regional climate research center in Washington state was usually the quietest part of the shift. No calls from editors, no arguments over headlines, no pressure to make forecasts sound dramatic. Emily Carter had worked the night rotation long enough to trust a simple rule: nights were for logic, mornings were for reports. That night, she did not notice the anomaly right away. One of the internal layers, visible only to analysts, automatically placed labels over pressure fields and cloud systems. Normally, these were familiar terms like low pressure, frontal boundary, or core circulation. This time, over a stretch of open ocean where nothing should have been labeled at all, a name appeared: Greater Adria. Emily assumed it was a harmless dictionary error. Internal databases sometimes picked up stray test entries when updates were rolled out. She restarted the model, switched satellite inputs, and opened a backup run. The label disappeared, then reappeared in the exact same position, as if the system confidently recognized that section of the map. She saved a screenshot and exported the event log. One line stood out precisely because of how neutral it sounded. Internal layer updated. When she tried to open the layer parameters, she found only an empty card with no description. That was not how legitimate features were documented. By morning, the problem no longer felt like a simple glitch. What unsettled her was not the word itself, but the way it was placed. The model treated it as naturally belonging to the map, no differently than the Pacific Ocean. Later that day, Emily searched for Greater Adria in public sources. The results were either unrelated or frustratingly vague. Eventually, she did something meteorologists rarely do. She contacted a university archive known for storing retired atlases, outdated globes, and discontinued teaching materials. The archive was managed by Margaret Lewis, a precise woman with the calm authority of someone who had spent decades explaining the same things to different people. The word Adria did not interest her. What caught her attention was Emily's phrasing. An internal layer labeled something that does not exist. Margaret paused, then mentioned that the archive had recently received materials from a defunct cartography contractor. Among the items were several globes marked in inventory as defective. No one had examined them closely yet. In the storage room, the boxes were stacked in neat rows, their labels faded. Margaret opened one and lifted out a globe that looked ordinary until Emily saw the ocean. 2 large areas were covered in thick white paint. Not clean or uniform like polar ice, but uneven, with drips and bubbles. Beneath the white, faint lines were visible, resembling coastlines. Margaret examined it carefully and said this did not resemble a printing defect. It looked like an attempt to cover something that had already been printed. Emily had a sudden, uncomfortable certainty. This was not a mistake. It was an object that should have been removed, and somehow was not. Margaret called in a restoration specialist. Arthur Klein arrived that evening with a small toolkit, a lamp, and the calm skepticism of someone used to deflating false discoveries. He did not comment on theories. He examined the surface. Under the lamp, the white layer reflected light differently than factory ink. Arthur tested the edge of the paint, removed a microscopic sample, and stated plainly that the white was applied later, and not with standard industrial materials. It behaved like a rushed cover, not part of the original process. Working carefully, he revealed a thin section beneath the paint. What emerged was not an abstract shape, but detailed cartography, curves, inlets, and fine coastal markings, printed with the same precision as the rest of the globe. Emily watched land appear where none should exist and thought of the model label. It felt less like discovering something new and more like uncovering something once considered normal. Arthur stopped the restoration deliberately and advised them not to continue out of curiosity. Everything needed to be documented. Objects like this did not disappear by accident. They found a marking near the base. Not a retail code, not a quality control stamp. It looked like an internal batch identifier, followed by a single letter that did not match standard conventions. Margaret noted that such markings were never used on public items. This globe was part of a version never meant for general distribution. Margaret began digging through the contractor's archived paperwork. Most of it was unremarkable. Color tables, print runs, form numbers. Then she found a page titled Layout Adjustments. The language was clinical. Additional contours in ocean regions were labeled as internal reference markers. One line erased the neutrality. Not for public printing. No explanation followed. Below it was a step listed as mandatory. White layer closure before storage. The implication was simple and unsettling. 2 versions existed. One for everyone, another for internal reference. And the documentation treated this as routine, not as a secret. That same afternoon, the archive received a phone call. Margaret answered and heard a polite voice claiming to represent the former contractor, asking about defective inventory. The company no longer existed. The caller requested a specific batch number. Margaret refused without written authorization. An hour later, the hallway camera failed for exactly 10 minutes. Not an hour. Not a full system outage. Just enough time for someone to move unnoticed. Margaret did not announce it, but she restricted access to the shelves and logged the change as she would any other anomaly. Emily returned to work, unable to look at satellite data the same way. A large storm system was forming offshore, a normal spiral of cloud cover. On impulse, she overlaid a photograph of the partially restored globe onto the live cloud image. At first, nothing matched. Then she adjusted the scale. The shapes aligned. Not perfectly, but convincingly enough that her mind could no longer dismiss it as coincidence. 2 distinctive curves, a long arc, indentations that behaved like bays. Arthur requested the original timestamp. He did not speculate. Timing, he said, would matter more than images. Later, Arthur carefully removed a tiny section where map labels were usually placed. Beneath the white layer, printed cleanly and deliberately, was the name, Greater Adria. The next day, Emily visited the Institute's technology department. She did not ask for explanations about the world. She asked where the system sourced the label. The administrator initially dismissed it, then opened internal references and hesitated. There was a service glossary embedded in the model, undocumented in user materials. It contained geographic labels that did not appear in standard datasets. When Emily requested an export, her access was temporarily restricted due to a security update. Her supervisor advised her to avoid drawing attention to a possible error. He sounded less concerned about mistakes than about what she had already seen. That evening, Margaret discovered that the box of globes had been quietly replaced. Same weight, same seal. Inside were ordinary defects, no white paint. Only one globe remained. Arthur had officially checked it out for restoration. Paperwork, not protection, had saved it. When Emily returned to the system logs, parts of the event history had been compressed, not erased, but rewritten. She understood then that telling the story openly would change nothing. Each element alone could be explained away. Software error, printing defect, coincidence in cloud patterns. So she did something practical. During a night shift when partial access remained, she ran the model and printed the internal layer through a legacy printer. Not for distribution, for a trace that could not be deleted with a single update. On the page, the label appeared again. Greater Adria. The next day, she re-examined the layout document. In the margin, faint pencil text caught her eye. Reference markers aligned with external layer. External could mean many things. External vendor, external file, external source, or something not contained within the map itself. That night, Emily looked again at the satellite image. The clouds had shifted, but one frame still held a shape that resembled a coastline too well to ignore. She began to suspect the point was never about hidden land. It was about versions. Some maps were not meant to describe the present, but to preserve orientation in something older, deeper, or no longer visible. Emily did not know who applied the white paint. She only knew that multiple versions of the world could exist simultaneously, and that occasionally, automated systems remembered what humans tried to forget. And when someone noticed the edge of that memory, they were not corrected. They were simply smoothed out of the picture.